July 11th, 1968. 10:47 a.m., St. Martin's Episcopal Church, Harlem. Frank Lucas stands at the threshold of the massive oak doors. He is not just attending a funeral, he is executing a hostile takeover. In the inside pocket of his tailored Italian suit sits a manila envelope thick enough to crack a rib. $100,000. All in large bills. Inside the church, the air is thick with the scent of lilies and the sweat of nervous men. The 5 families are represented in the front pews. The street bosses from the Bronx and Brooklyn are watching the entrance. They are waiting to see who will crumble now that the king is dead. Frank does not crumble. He adjusts his cufflinks, signals his brother, and steps into the nave. The silence that follows is not out of respect for the dead. It is born of sudden, paralyzing fear of the living. Because Frank is not just carrying cash. He is carrying the one thing that will make the Genovese crime family, the corrupt NYPD, and every hustler on 116th Street regret the day they underestimated the quiet driver from North Carolina. What he does in the next 30 minutes will not just secure his legacy, it will rewrite the physics of the international drug trade. But here's the thing. The money was not for the widow. 4 days earlier, July 7th, 1968, Wells Restaurant, Harlem, the air conditioning was rattling, struggling against the humid New York summer. Frank Lucas sat across from the man who had taught him everything, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. For 15 years, Bumpy had run Harlem with a chess player's mind and an executioner's hand. He was the buffer between the black underworld and the Italian Mafia. Bumpy was eating fried chicken and drinking coffee. He looked tired. The streets were changing. The hippies, the drugs, the lack of honor, it was weighing on him. "The world is yours, Frank," Bumpy whispered, clutching his chest. "But you have got to take it." Moments later, Bumpy Johnson collapsed. Pandemonium erupted. But while the waiters screamed and the patrons scrambled, Frank Lucas went still. He watched the life fade from the eyes of the king of Harlem. In that precise second, Frank calculated the vacuum Bumpy was leaving behind. The Italians would want their territory back. The young hustlers would tear the streets apart, fighting for scraps. Frank knew he had less than 96 hours before the funeral to formulate a plan that would stop a war and start an empire. He did not want a slice of the pie. He wanted the bakery. The funeral ended, but the real ceremony was just beginning. The underworld operates on perception, and right now, the perception was that Harlem was open for conquest. The Italians, specifically the Genovese family, assumed the supply chain would remain the same. They controlled the import. Harlem controlled the distribution. They took 60 cents of every dollar. It was a stranglehold that kept the black gangsters rich, but subservient. Frank Lucas sat in his apartment on 116th Street. He had a map spread out on the table. Not a map of New York, a map of Southeast Asia. "They want their cut," his brother whispered, looking out the window at a parked sedan that had been there for 6 hours. "Fat Tony wants a sit down." "Let him wait," Frank said. Frank had $400,000 liquid cash stashed in the floorboards. It was seed money, but he was not going to spend it on Italian heroin that had been stepped on 4 times before it even crossed the George Washington Bridge. This is where it gets interesting. Frank knew something the Italians did not. He had a cousin in the army stationed in a place most Americans could not find on a globe, the Golden Triangle, the border region of Thailand, Laos, and Burma. While the mob was fighting over who got the corner of 125th Street, Frank boarded a Pan Am flight to Bangkok. He arrived in a world of oppressive heat and chaos. He traveled upriver, deep into the jungle, to a location that did not exist in any CIA file. There, he met a warlord who controlled the poppy fields. The math was staggering. In New York, a kilo of heroin cost $50,000 and was 10% pure. In the jungle, a kilo cost $4,200 and was 100% pure. Frank bought 132 kilos on the spot. But now he had a problem that would kill most men. How do you move 132 kilos of product halfway across the world? through a war zone, past US Customs, and into the Bronx without the Mafia or the FBI knowing. He needed a ghost. Frank Lucas was not a gangster in the traditional sense. He was a corporate CEO operating in an illegal marketplace. He looked at the drug trade and saw inefficiency. Middlemen, he told his reflection in the mirror of his Bangkok hotel room, they eat the profit. He realized he needed an infrastructure that relied on loyalty, not fear. The Italians used fear. Bumpy used respect. Frank used blood. He devised the country boy strategy. He would not hire street guys from Harlem who knew the game and had bad habits. He went back home to North Carolina. He recruited his brothers, his cousins, guys who had grown up plowing fields and fixing tractors, men who had never seen a $100 bill, let alone $1 million. He moved them into apartments in the Bronx. He bought them cars. He dressed them. You do not talk to nobody, he instructed them. You do not look at nobody. You work for me. This insulated him. The NYPD narcs could lean on a street dealer and he might flip. But a country boy who owes his entire life, his suit, and his mother's house to Frank, that bond is unbreakable. But the product, that was his masterstroke. He called it blue magic. Most dealers were selling garbage, brown sludge that was 5% to 10% pure. Junkies were shooting up just to stop the sickness, not to get high. Frank decided to release blue magic at 98% purity. It was a death sentence for the competition. It was also a literal death sentence for users who were not careful. But in the twisted economics of the heroin trade, overdoses are the best marketing. If a product is strong enough to kill, everyone wants it. He priced it lower than the competition. Better product. Lower price. Total market saturation. But he still had to get it into the country. November 1968. The first shipment was ready. The FBI had ramped up surveillance at JFK and the shipping docks. The French Connection, the traditional route through Marseille, was being watched by every agency with a badge. Frank had 72 hours to move the product before the monsoon rains made the jungle roads impassable. He turned to his contact, an Army sergeant named Leslie Ike Atkinson. The plan was audacious, horrifying, genius. They were not going to use shipping containers. They were not going to use false-bottom suitcases. They were going to use the US military's own logistics. Dead soldiers were coming home from Vietnam every day. The government did not search the coffins of heroes. Or so the theory went. Frank arranged for false bottoms to be installed in the shipping pallets. Some say the coffins themselves, carrying the fallen soldiers. Think about the risk if one dog barked, if one MP got curious, if one crate was dropped. Frank Lucas faces the electric chair. Treason, trafficking, desecration. The plane landed at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. Frank was waiting in a car 2 miles away, watching through binoculars. 1:15 a.m. The transport truck left the base. It did not turn toward the military morgue, it turned toward the highway. Frank let out a breath. He felt like he had been holding for a month. But the obstacles were not over. The Italian Mafia had noticed the change on the street. Their dealers were standing on corners with empty pockets. The junkies were walking past them, looking for the blue magic. The Genovese family summoned Frank to a social club in East Harlem. This was the moment. They were going to demand a tax, a vig. They wanted 40% of his action, or they would burn his operation to the ground. Frank walked in alone. No bodyguards, just him in his tailored suit. The capo, a man named Fat Tony, sat at a table eating veal. "You are making a lot of noise, Frank," Tony said, not looking up. "We need to regulate the noise." Frank sat down. He did not eat. He placed a small plastic bag on the table. "Blue magic. I do not need regulation," Frank said calmly. "I need distribution. You guys have the downtown clubs. You have the Wall Street connections. I have the product. I will sell to you. Wholesale. You step on it, you sell it, you keep the profit. But do not ever ask me for a tax again." The room went dead silent. A black man dictating terms to the mob in 1968? It was a suicide note. But Tony looked at the bag. He knew the quality. He knew the street value. He did the math in his head. Frank was offering them millions of dollars in easy profit versus a war they might lose against a guy who supplied the best product on earth. Tony smiled. Okay, Frank, we will buy. By 1970, Frank Lucas was making $1 million a day. Read that again. A day. He had so much cash he could not launder it fast enough. He bought office buildings in Detroit, apartments in Los Angeles, thousands of acres of cattle land in North Carolina, but the banks were flagging him. He had to hide the physical cash. This is what nobody knew at the time. Frank started using the clothes dryer in his Bronx safe house. He would fill the drum with $100 bills and run it on tumble with no heat just to soften the crisp new bills so they would fit tighter into duffel bags. He buried money in the backyard of his parents' home. But the biggest reveal, the biggest secret, it was not just the Italians he owned. It was the Special Investigations Unit of the NYPD. These were the elite narcs, the princes of the city. And Frank Lucas was their landlord. Every Friday, a bagman would drop off $20,000 to a designated detective. In exchange, Frank got the shift schedules. He got the wiretap logs. He got the names of informants. He had built the perfect machine. He had the supply, the distribution, the peace treaty, and the protection. He was untouchable, or so he thought. Because while Frank was looking at the Italians and the cops, he forgot to look at the one thing that brings down every empire: ego. March 8th, 1971, Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. The entire world was watching. Frank Lucas had reached a level of wealth that is hard to comprehend. But wealth in the shadows was not enough anymore. He wanted to be seen. He arrived at the garden. He was not sitting in the back. He was not in a box. He was ringside. And he was not wearing a tuxedo. Frank Lucas stepped out wearing a chinchilla coat, floor length, $50,000, and a matching hat. The camera flashes popped like lightning. Frank sat down. 3 seats away sat the Italian Mafia bosses. They were wearing standard gray suits. They looked like accountants. Frank looked like an emperor. At that moment, Richie Roberts, a detective from New Jersey who was too honest for his own good, was scanning the crowd with binoculars. He saw the coat. He saw the seating arrangement. He saw the Italians leaning in to talk to Frank with deference. "Who is that?" Roberts asked. "That is Frank Lucas," another cop said. "Nobody. Nobody with a $50,000 coat is nobody," Roberts muttered. Click. That was the sound of the camera shutter that sealed Frank's fate. That photo made the front page. It embarrassed the mafia. It alerted the feds. It woke up the IRS. The chinchilla coat was the loudest shout in the history of organized crime. It was Frank screaming, "I won." And it was the beginning of the end. January 1975. The raid happened at dawn. A combined task force of DEA, NYPD, and New Jersey detectives hit Frank's house in Teaneck, New Jersey. They did not find the heroin. Frank was too smart for that. But they found the money, $584,683 in cash, stuffed in bags, in the ceiling, in the laundry hampers. Frank Lucas was arrested. He was looking at 70 years, a lifetime in a cage. But Frank had one more card to play. The ultimate strategic pivot. He looked at the prosecutors. He looked at the Italian mobsters who were now planning to kill him for drawing so much heat. He looked at the corrupt cops who had been bleeding him dry for years. "I can give you the Italians," the prosecutor offered. "No," Frank said, leaning forward, his eyes cold. "I can give you something better. I can give you the police." Frank Lucas turned informant. The ripple effect was catastrophic. Based on Frank's testimony, the government decimated the Genovese family's heroin operations. But more importantly, the ensuing investigation tore the NYPD apart. The SIU, the Elite Narcotics Unit, was disbanded. Dozens of detectives were indicted or forced to resign. Frank Lucas, the man who walked into Bumpy Johnson's funeral with a pocket full of cash, had effectively dismantled the entire ecosystem of New York crime, both the criminals and the cops. He served his time. He got out. He went back in. He got out again. But the legend remained. He proved that a black man from the rural South could outthink the mafia, outmaneuver the US government, and build a global supply chain that Fortune 500 companies would envy. He showed that in the underworld, violence is a tool, but logistics is king. To this day, there are arguments on the street corners of Harlem about the coffins. Did he really put the dope in with the bodies? Ike Atkinson says it was in the furniture, not the bodies. Frank swore until his death it was the coffins. Maybe the truth does not matter. The myth was strong enough to make him a king. Frank Lucas passed away in 2019. He died a free man. But ask yourself this: if you had $100,000 cash in 1968 and the throne of Harlem was empty, would you have walked through those church doors? If you want to know more about the dark history of the American underworld, hit that subscribe button. We are digging up the stories they tried to bury. Leave a comment below. Was Frank Lucas a genius businessman or just a ruthless criminal? And do you believe the coffin story? I want to hear your take.